What we've done so far is just introduce the book and cover the first 11 verses. There are themes we're tracing through the book. And I won't go back over all the themes this morning. I'll just say that we have covered the first one, which is the people that Paul addressed, the people at Philippi. We are given the background to that church in Acts chapter 16, where Paul, through the Macedonian vision, is brought to Philippi, the first place in Europe that he evangelized. He established a church there on the riverbanks with the first convert, Lydia, a seller of purple. And after Lydia, he encountered the Philippian jailer as a prisoner, which is pertinent to this letter because he writes it from prison. And from that started a church that 10 years later we find in the book of Philippians. It's a loving church, but there is some division there. In particular, there are two women that are mentioned in chapter 4 that he encourages to agree in the Lord. And we'll get to some of those issues later when we get to chapter 2. But the second theme, after we talk about the people, verses 1 through 11, is the imprisonment. And I plan to spend 2 weeks on the imprisonment. It's very important to understanding the letter as a whole. I'll remind you what we said 2 weeks ago. This letter, along with Ephesians and Colossians and Philemon, are the prison epistles. But they're not the only epistles written from prison. We also have 2 Timothy, which was written in a second Roman imprisonment. And it would be his last, and it would be the imprisonment in which he ended his life. So let's talk about this imprisonment. I think a lot of people are unfamiliar with how Paul came to be in prison in Rome at the writing of this epistle. And if you haven't studied the book of Acts recently, you need a refresher on this, because it's not something we talk about a whole lot. So I'd like to get that background. First, looking at Philippians chapter 1, verse 12, at a statement that he makes about this imprisonment. And just think about the attitude behind this statement. He says, "I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel." That's the opposite of what you would think. You would think if the Lord's servants are humiliated, thrown into prison, killed for preaching the gospel, it would set the church back. And he's saying the opposite is true. What has happened in this unfair imprisonment and false accusations has advanced the gospel. God works in marvelous ways. So let's go back to the book of Acts and get some information about this imprisonment. And we're going to go to Acts chapter 19 and start there. Verse 21 of Acts 19. This is Luke writing, who traveled with Paul quite a bit. And he says, "After these events, Paul resolved in the Spirit to pass through Macedonia and Achaia and go to Jerusalem, saying, 'After I have been there, I must also see Rome.'" In that one verse, Luke encapsulates a lot of what is said in Paul's letters about his intentions. So let's break this down a little bit about Paul's travel plans. The Spirit had communicated to him in various ways, including visions, that he should go through the area of Macedonia. And in going through Macedonia, he should remember the poor in Judea, namely Jerusalem. Apparently there was a famine there. People were starving, people in the church and people outside the church. And Paul wanted to take up a collection among the churches of Macedonia and Achaia. Now, what he means by that are churches like Thessalonica. We have 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. Philippi, the letter we're studying, is addressed to the brethren there. And the church at Corinth. We have 2 letters addressed to the church at Corinth. And in the letters to Philippi and Corinth, you read a lot about the contribution. A lot of the lessons that we teach on giving come from Philippians and 2 Corinthians. 2 Corinthians chapters 8 and 9, we draw from that a lot. 1 Corinthians 16 tells us to give on the first day of every week. And 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7 is where we learn that we should purpose in our heart or make plans in our heart what we should give. We should plan our giving and be intentional about it. We go to these verses quite a bit. And it's because these are letters Paul is writing to build up a collection so that when he passed through those Gentile congregations, he could collect relief aid for the churches in the Jewish congregations in Judea and in Jerusalem. His idea was, I'll take physical aid from churches that had benefited spiritually by Jews to the Jews who could benefit spiritually from the Gentiles. I said that wrong. Could benefit physically from the Gentiles. So the Gentiles were blessed physically, the Jews were blessed spiritually, and they would aid one another. And this would promote unity among Jews and Gentiles in the church. You know, that was a problem. There was a lot of division among Jews and Gentiles and questions about things like circumcision and the cultural differences, which is going to come up in his imprisonment. So this is where we start in Acts 19, verse 21. He had planned, after delivering this contribution to Jerusalem, to go to Rome and visit Rome for the first time. And he talks about these plans in the letter to the Romans. In chapter 1, he says, I'm going to deliver this contribution to Jerusalem. Then I'm going to come see you for the first time. And I want to be helped on my way to Spain by you. So we know he planned to go even further out. Sadly, he was never able to complete those plans. It wasn't the Lord's will. But that was what he had in mind. Now let's turn over to Acts 21. We're going to see him begin to fulfill these plans. He's able to get the collection from the churches of Macedonia and Achaia, Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth. He's able to gather that together, and he makes it to Jerusalem. But things then take a different turn. Let's start reading Acts 21:17. Luke's writing, so he's with Paul. When we had come to Jerusalem, the brothers, the church there, received us gladly. On the following day, Paul went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. Now this is James, the brother of Jesus in the flesh, half-brother. He's one of the elders at Jerusalem. And verse 19 says, after greeting them, he related one by one the things that God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. And when they heard it, they glorified God, and they said to him, you see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews of those who have believed. They are all zealous for the law. He's talking about the law of Moses. And they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. This is a little difficult to understand. Their concern, as you see, is not about Gentile Christians, but they specify that they have heard reports, slanderous reports, that Paul is teaching all the Jews among the Gentiles to forsake Moses. And what they mean there, the best we can tell, is the customs of the Jews, the heritage of the Jews. They're not speaking to a religious thing, necessarily. But it's hard for us to understand being raised in a church, in a culture that talks often about the separation of church and state. it's hard for us to understand what life was like for Jewish people in Gentile areas. Their religion and their culture was intertwined, very closely intertwined. And so it was hard to suss out for them when to act like a Jew and when to let things go. And so what Paul is preaching is things like, you don't have to be circumcised to be a Christian. And he's saying this to Gentiles who are concerned about it, and to whom Jewish Christians have been saying, if you're not circumcised, you can't go to heaven. You can't be saved. If you don't observe the Sabbath, you can't be saved. If you don't live as a Jew, although you're a Gentile, you can't be saved. And Paul is combating that attitude, which is clearly false, and he's doing this in Gentile regions. That has been twisted by his enemies into something like Jews should not be circumcised. Jews should not celebrate their cultural differences and practices. Jews should not observe Jewish holidays. You shouldn't be a Jew at all. That's the idea they are claiming Paul is preaching. Now, he's not doing that. But the elders are concerned about division in the church at Jerusalem, and they're concerned about persecution of Paul in particular. And so they're about to give him a plan for smoothing things over with the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem. So let's see what their plan is. We're in verse 22 now of Acts 21. What then is to be done? They will certainly hear that you have come. Do therefore what we tell you. This is advice from elders. It's not inspired advice. It doesn't seem to be. But it's the wisdom of the elders that, can be flawed. Human beings give flawed advice. So maybe this wasn't the best advice. But they say, do therefore what we tell you. Verse 24, or verse 23. We have 4 men who are under a vow. This is a Jewish custom, this vow. Voluntary vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them, and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads. Thus all will know that there is nothing in what they have been told about you, but that you yourself also live in observance of the law. Some people think this might be the Nazirite vow. When you get to the end of it, you shave those heads that have never seen a razor. Maybe that's what it is. We don't know exactly. He says, but as for the Gentiles who believed, we sent a letter with our judgment that they should abstain from what has been sacrificed to idols, from blood, what has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. So they go back to a letter they compose in Acts 15. So the idea is, we want you to be seen observing Jewish customs in the temple to smooth things over with Jewish Christians who think you're against Jewish customs. So Paul, being submissive to the elders in Jerusalem, which is fascinating to me because he's the Apostle Paul, but he's submissive to these elders, he follows through with their advice. He finds these 4 men, he pays their expenses, he honors this vow, and we come to verse 26. Paul took them in. The next day he purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and the offering presented for each one of them. Now, verse 27, when the 7 days were almost completed, the Jews from Asia, these are the places where he's been taking missionary journeys, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him, crying, Men of Israel, help! This is the man who is teaching everyone everywhere against the people, the Jewish people, and the law and this place, the law of Moses and the temple. That's the charge. He's been teaching against the Jews, the law of Moses, and the temple. Moreover, he even brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this place. Now, Luke clarifies that they'd seen a Gentile with him in the city of Jerusalem, Trophimus, and connected that to the temple, but he had not brought Trophimus into the temple, which would have been a violation of Mosaic law. He'd just been with him in Jerusalem. Verse 30, Then all the city was stirred up, and the people ran together. They seized Paul, dragged him out of the temple, and at once the gates were shut. And as they were seeking to kill him, the word came to the tribune of the cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. So now Rome gets involved. Let's stop right there. Paul obeys the elders, takes a vow to show that he is not against the customs of the Jews. Some people think this was a sin that Paul committed. I wouldn't go that far. Some people say he was honoring the law too much. I don't think Paul would have made that mistake. We don't have enough information, so I give him the benefit of the doubt. Some people don't. It doesn't matter. What happened was bad advice because it put him in a vulnerable position to be accused and arrested by the Jewish authorities. Now, when all this confusion and controversy boiled up, the Romans did what the Romans do. They just started arresting people, and Paul seemed to be the problem, so they arrested him. They take him into custody. He asks to be allowed to speak. The tribune gives him a chance to address the crowd. When he does, things get even hotter. They start to beat him. He sends word to the tribune that he's a Roman citizen who cannot be lashed without a trial, a hearing. So then they put him in prison where he awaits his appeal to Caesar. And he goes through a series of trials before Romans, before Jewish authorities, and eventually winds up in Rome. And there is where he writes these letters. So you know a little bit now about how he got arrested, how he came to Rome. I skipped a lot, like a shipwreck, an amazing experience on a barbarian island where he gets snake bit. He converts many people in his travels as a prisoner to Rome. But we get to Philippians, he's in Rome under house arrest, being watched by the imperial guard. So let's go to Philippians now that we have that background and look at the imprisonment in verses 12 through 26. We'll talk more about the imprisonment next week, but this is all we'll have time to cover this morning. Let's look at verses 12 through 14 to begin. He says, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. What kind of situation is he in? The ESV translates this, the imperial guard. Verse 13, it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. So that gives us a clue. The Greek here is the Praetorian Guard. Praetorian has to do with Caesar, thus the word imperial. This was an elite guard in the Roman army. It was 10,000 hand-picked soldiers. They had the rank on the level of a centurion. A centurion, you can tell from the name, is a commander over 100 soldiers. So each of the Praetorian guards or the imperial guards had that rank. It was an elite group of soldiers. This was the emperor's private bodyguard. Now, you know how many attempts on the life of the emperor was made. I mean, his life was threatened everywhere that he went. So these men had to be good. They had special privileges. They received double the pay of a common Roman soldier, and they received their own quarters in Rome. They retired after 12 to 16 years and were given Roman citizenship and a liberal grant. They guarded Paul probably more for his protection than to keep him imprisoned. They didn't see him as a flight threat because he was eager to go to Rome and testify before Caesar. He wanted this opportunity, and by the time we get to Philippians where he's in Rome, everybody knows this about Paul. They're not worried about him staging some kind of revolt or running away. They're worried about people killing him. The standard practice was for these guards to work in 6-hour shifts. And this would be 4 soldiers a day. So Paul had exclusive time with each of these soldiers, 6 hours a day. And knowing what you know about the Apostle Paul, what is he talking to them about? They became the captives, right? He had a captive audience that had to stay with him, and he'd talk to them about their souls. He'd talk to them about Jesus, talk to them about the gospel and salvation. So his chains influenced those guarding him, but also gave confidence to the local Christians in Rome. He says, most of the brothers, verse 14, have become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment and are much more bold to speak the word without fear. If Paul can be fighting for his life in prison and preaching the gospel without fear, then I, who am a free man in Rome, can do the same. So this is what he means when he says, what has happened to me, my imprisonment, has really served to advance the gospel. Now we can look at this as 3 tools that serve to advance the gospel. So we've just covered the first one, his chains. His chains serve to advance the gospel. But there's more. There are 2 other tools that God used. The second one are his critics. While he's been in prison, people have sought to take advantage of the situation. They see Paul as a threat to their reputation. There are many other preachers in Rome and throughout the area where the church has been established. And I'll let you in on a secret about preachers. They can act all humble and act like they don't care about the other guys, but they're very competitive, okay? They can be proud sometimes. And this is a universal rule. It's gone on for a long time. And so this is going on in Paul's day. Let's read about this in verses 15 through 18. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter, the ones who do it from goodwill, do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former, those who preach out of envy and rivalry, proclaim Christ out of rivalry, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. So he's rejoicing here, and this is the letter of joy. He's rejoicing that rivals are preaching the gospel to compete with him. That's some attitude, right? That's a really good attitude, and we all need to learn where that comes from. So let's look at it. Are these false teachers? I don't think they're false teachers. That's not what's going on. Otherwise, Paul wouldn't be rejoicing about this. He was very much against false teaching, as we all should be. So what's their motive? Maybe money? In 2 Corinthians, he talks a lot about people like this. And he calls them in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 17, peddlers of God's Word. So they use the Bible like people would use goods. And they would exchange their teaching for money. Now, there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but when that's the only motive behind preaching the gospel, corruption happens. Why is that? Well, the more ears you tickle, the more money you make. And if your teaching's going to threaten your pocketbook, if the teaching of Scripture is going to threaten your pocketbook, you will shy away from that. And you'll tend toward the popular topics and stray away from the unpopular topics. That's the problem with that. Most likely, the motive was arrogance and conceit. Paul just got under people's skin because he was so popular. He drew so many crowds. He was so highly respected. And he was a latecomer. He wasn't one of the original 12, and yet he referred to himself as an apostle. He had this story about seeing the Lord Jesus on the road to Damascus. There were others with him, but none of the other apostles saw this. None of the preachers of the gospel saw this. This is Paul's story. Yes, he could work miracles, and that confirmed it, but that just made them angrier. Who's this Johnny-come-lately that comes in here and is building churches all over the place, in Gentile areas? They were very jealous about that. There's kind of a funny statement in 2 Corinthians 11, verse 5, where he says, I'm not the least bit inferior to these super apostles. He's come up, that's one translation of it. But that is an interesting designation for these competitors. They're super apostles, air quotes, right? He doesn't really believe them to be apostles, but they promote themselves as better apostles than Paul. And he's saying, I'm not inferior to these men. So he's not insecure at all. He says, if my being in prison and their jealousy makes them preach the truth more, so be it. I rejoice in that. Whatever gets them fired up, that's fine with me. And he said that he is set for the defense of the gospel. Verse 16. That word defense, I'll talk about it in just a minute. The Greek is apologia. It's the word from which we get our word apologize. But it's not saying I'm sorry. It's more like what we call apologetics. Maybe you've heard that term for Christian evidences. And it means to defend the truth, defend the gospel. Sometimes we use it to refer to defense of the existence of God. It's a word used in 1 Peter 3:15, where Peter says we need to always be ready to give a defense or give a reason for the hope that is in us with gentleness and respect. So we need to always be ready to give an answer for the reason of the hope that is in us. And Paul is doing that while in prison. So first of all, you have his chains, that's advancing the gospel. Secondly, you have his critics advancing the gospel. And the third tool that God used while Paul was in prison in Rome was his crisis. He is in a life or death situation. And let's read verses 19 through 26. And as I read this, ask yourself, what is Paul's expectation? How does he think this imprisonment will end? Let's look at it. Yes, and I will rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance. As it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but that with full courage now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I am to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me, yet which I shall choose I cannot tell. I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in the faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Christ Jesus because of my coming to you again. So what did he expect? What does he say in verse 19? Deliverance. He expected to be released. And verse 25, he says that he knows that he will remain and continue with them all for their progress and their joy in the faith. Chapter 2, verse 24, he says, I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. Not only does he expect to be released, he expects to make a trip to Philippi. In Philemon, a letter we'll study at the end of this quarter, he expresses the same expectation. You'll notice, though, he doesn't expect to be released because he is suffering or because he doesn't want to die. He expects to be released because he's still useful in the kingdom and God still has plans for him to glorify God. That's the sole purpose in Paul's life, is to bring glory to God with what life he has left. And when he's done with that, he's ready to go. That's his attitude about death. His firm expectation is that he would not be ashamed, but that with full courage Christ would be honored in his body by life or death. Verse 20 has this phrase, eager expectation. And that's an interesting word. It's used in Luke 21:28 in the idea of raised up head. So he's like standing on his tiptoes, arching his neck, looking for this courage and looking toward being honored in his body, whether it is by life or by death. His hopes didn't hang on circumstances, but on his faith in God. Now, he wasn't afraid, and these verses probably are the best known verses from Philippians 1, where he says, verse 21, "To me to live is Christ, and to die is gain." And then verse 23, he says he's hard pressed between the two, between life and death. His desire was to depart and be with Christ. He knew life was better on the other side. And all of us know that, but how many of us get to the point where we say, I'm good with living because I can honor Christ, but my desire is to go on and be with the Lord. I've heard people say that, but usually that's after a lot of pain near the end of their lives. And Paul has been through his share of pain and persecution for sure, but that kind of faith is rare to say, I'd rather be with Christ. He was hard-pressed between these two options. And he decided it was better for the believers in Philippi in the furtherance of the gospel to remain so that they could progress in their joy in the faith. But for him to die was gain. Now, look at verse 23 again, and notice the word that he uses for death. He says, my desire is to depart. It's a journey, a transition. It's not termination. It's not extinction. It's not the end for him. It's a journey to depart. And this word is interesting. It's used in various ways throughout Scripture. And this is a way to learn what death truly is, to look at this word depart. 3 ways that it's used. Number 1, it was used by soldiers. And soldiers used it to mean to take down your tent and move on. Now, with that in mind, go to 2 Corinthians 5. Soldiers use this word to take down your tent and move on. To pick up stakes, we say sometimes. Look at 2 Corinthians 5, verses 1 and following. We know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. If indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan being burdened, not that we should be unclothed, but that we should be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. What does he mean by the word tent in this text? Our body, that's right, our physical body. And he says, in this body we groan. But he looks at death as taking down the tent and putting on a heavenly dwelling. And we see heavenly dwelling and we usually think of heaven itself. But what he's talking about there is the glorified resurrection body. So the part is used by soldiers to take down a tent. And that's interesting because you go to 2 Corinthians 5 and Paul speaks of death as the destruction of the physical tent, our body, and putting on a heavenly tent, the resurrection body. Now, the second way this term is used, it's a political term describing the setting free of the prisoner. Setting free of the prisoner. And with that in mind, I want to take you to Romans 8. Romans 8, verse 18. I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of Him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself, look at this, will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. The redemption of our bodies, again, is the resurrection. And notice again, verse 21, he describes that, among other ways, in terms of being set free from bondage to corruption. So this term Paul uses in Philippians, to depart, also had a political sense of being set free from bondage, and that's how Paul describes the resurrection in Romans chapter 8. There's a third way that it's used. It's also used by farmers to mean unyoking the oxen. So depart means breaking down the tent. You can see the application there. You're taking things apart, moving one piece from another piece. It means set free from bondage. So depart from your chains, to break the cuffs and set free. And now farmers use it to unyoke the oxen. You take the parts of the yoke off the oxen and set it free. And with that in mind, let's go to Revelation 14, verse 13. John hears a voice from heaven. Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labors, for their deeds follow them. So again, in other places you see the idea of the way the farmers use that word depart. Resting from labor, the unyoking of the oxen. And so, for Paul, that's what it meant. It meant to be free of the body, the tent of this body. It meant to be set free from bondage, the slavery and corruption of this world. And it meant to be free from the labors that burden us as an oxen is set free from its yoke. And of course, he says to depart and be with Christ. Verse 23 of Philippians 1. He says that is far better. Now, as we bring this to a close, go to verse 21 of Philippians 1 again. And I want you to look at this statement that we all know very well. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Now, a good test of where your priorities are in life is to put a blank in where Christ is and gain is. Sharon, did you want to say something? Yeah.
It's about verse 22.
Uh-huh.
When he says, "Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell."
Mm-hmm.
It's not really his choice, is it? Is he talking about between life and death? That's the way I read it.
It's not his choice what will happen, but he's talking about his choice of what he would prefer. His preference. So if you look at what I should choose as a preference, you probably feel more comfortable with that. He doesn't think that he's in control. Yeah, you're right. So in verse 21, for me to live is blank, and to die is blank. Now we know what Paul puts in those blanks. For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. A good exercise for you is to ask yourself, what do you put in that blank? You know what you should put in the blank. That's not what I'm talking about. The way you're living your life right now and where your mind is right now, what do you live for? Is Christ the number one priority in your life? Could you truthfully put His name in the blank? Could you say, for me to live is Christ? He is my all. He is the number one thing in my life. And then what do you think of death? What is death to you? Could you say to die is gain? Have you been living in such a way that death would be gain for you? Or do you have to admit that right now sin stands between you and the Lord, and if He were to come today, you wouldn't be in a good position? Or have you lived right and you just don't have the conviction of Paul that better things await you on the other side? I'm not talking about the fear of the pain that you go through in the process of death. I'm not talking about the loss that you don't want to have when you're separated from loved ones. I'm talking about the experience in the afterlife. What is that to you? Would you say, for me, to die is fear? To die is horror? To die is anguish? Or can you say with Paul, to die is gain? Now, the gospel, if it's consumed and digested and believed, fully believed, produces Paul's statement, for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And that's what we're all working for, is that faith that we see in Philippians 1:21. I want to encourage you to think about that and pray about that and examine yourselves and see what you would put in those blanks, honestly and truly, in your life. And that's all the time we have this morning. It got warm in here. Maybe it's